When I opened that coffin, there was no body inside, only a note that said, "He never rested here."
That night, the wind seemed to carry with it voices that didn't belong to this world. I walked slowly through the cemetery, and each step I took echoed as if someone were following me closely, even though the space was completely empty. The twisted trees cast shadows that stretched across the ancient tombstones, and it felt as if the dead were silently observing my every move. Many say cemeteries are places of rest, but I learned early on that in some corners of the earth, what lies beneath the ground finds no peace, merely remains trapped, waiting for the right moment to manifest itself. It's strange to think that it all began with a simple request for maintenance on a tomb that almost no one visited. To anyone else, it would have been just another routine job, but for me, it became the most disturbing story I've ever experienced. When I removed the aged wooden lid, I expected to find bones worn by time, but what I saw made me doubt reality itself. The coffin was empty, and right in the center, on the torn lining, was only an old note, carefully folded, as if it had been left there on purpose to be found. With trembling hands, I unfolded the paper and read the sentence that would forever change my understanding of what it means to die. He never rested here. There was no signature, just those cold words that seemed to whisper directly into my mind. And in that instant, I understood that something much larger and darker was at play. If that man had never rested in that coffin, then where was his body? This question haunted me for entire nights until I finally decided to look for answers, without imagining how much this would drag me into secrets that should never be revealed. If you enjoy dark tales and want to hear every secret the gravediggers reveal, subscribe to the channel now and leave your like to strengthen this investigation. My name is Henry Walker, and strangely enough, the cemetery has been my home for much of my life. From a young age, I learned to deal with death in a way most people never would. While many avoid these places, fearing the echoes of untold stories and the silences that seem to speak, I found they're a profession and, in a way, a refuge. Working as a gravedigger was never just a profession. For me, it was a silent ritual of living with what others refused to face. Each grave dug, each headstone erected, each coffin lowered into the earth represented a painful memory, but also a way of understanding that the end is inevitable and that deep down, no one is prepared for it. Although my routine seemed simple to the outsider, my heart bore deep scars. Years earlier, I had lost my only son under circumstances I could never fully explain, and that absence followed me like an inseparable shadow. Perhaps that was why I spent so much time alone, avoiding unnecessary conversations, immersed in a solitude that became more comforting than any company. The cemetery accepted me without judgment, and I, in return, dedicated every hour of my day to it. Gradually, my life became a repetitive cycle, where the presence of the dead seemed more constant than that of the living. There were times when I thought I felt invisible, gazes following me among the graves. And though I tried to ignore it, I knew something about that place always escaped logic. It was as if each tombstone held secrets that still breathed, and the wind was merely the messenger that brought them to me. But none of this had prepared me for the day I was called to inspect the tomb of one of the city's most influential families. At first, I saw it as a common task, just another one among many. However, a strange sensation accompanied me from the moment I received the order. It was as if the very ground refused to be disturbed, as if the deep roots hid a truth no one wanted to bring to light. I didn't know it, but I was about to discover something that would forever change the way I viewed life, death, and what lies in between. The next morning, the sky seemed unusually heavy, as if the clouds had gathered just to witness what was about to happen. I walked to the Halloway family tomb with my usual tools, trying to treat it as just another routine maintenance job. But with each step I took along the narrow path of ancient stones, the feeling of unease grew. The tomb was surrounded by a rusty iron fence, ornamented with symbols that resembled distorted crosses, as if they were more an adornment of vanity than devotion. Everything there seemed charged with an energy that did not belong to eternal rest. As I began the opening process, the sound of the screws grinding echoed like muffled screams in the silence of the cemetery. The coffin lid was deteriorated by time, the worm-eaten wood splintering with every movement, and I couldn't tell if I was trembling from the physical exertion or the strange presence I felt behind me. With effort, I managed to lift the lid, expecting to find fragile bones, perhaps just a whitish dust that confirmed the passing of time. But what I saw was very different. The coffin was completely empty, no sign of bones, no signs of decomposition, just a torn lining, yellowed by humidity, and right in the center, resting like a cursed signature, a carefully folded note, as if placed there not by chance, but by someone who wanted it to be found one day. I held the paper with trembling hands, feeling that this small piece of paper weighed more than any body I had ever buried. As I unfolded it, the phrase written in jagged handwriting pierced me like a whisper from the depths. He never rested here. No name, no explanation, just those words that sounded more like a sentence than a simple message. In that instant, I realized I had touched something that should never have been revealed, and the emptiness of the coffin was not just an absence, but an even more disturbing presence. The note became an obsession, and the more I tried to forget it, the more it seemed to call my name in the silent nights, demanding that I search for the hidden truth behind those words. After that day, the note stuck in my mind. I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than a hoax or some past mistake, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized there was no logic to the scene. An empty coffin inside an intact tomb was impossible to explain simply. There were no signs of rape, no signs of it having been opened before. Everything indicated it had never contained a body. The question gnawing at me was clear. Why, then, would someone fake a burial and leave such a cryptic message? It was in this whirlwind of thoughts that I decided to search the town's old records. The small local registry office held dusty books filled with names no one had spoken in a long time. Leafing through the yellowed pages, I found the death certificate of Richard Halloway, the family patriarch. Officially, it stated that he had died in his mansion after a long illness and was buried with full honors. However, something bothered me. There was no record of a wake, no testimonies from neighbors or family members other than his wife. It was as if the entire ceremony had taken place behind closed doors. The further I went, the more fragments of rumors emerged. Some accounts spoke of a man who, at the height of his fortune, had dabbled in shady dealings, seeking wealth and influence through pacts few would dare speak aloud. Others claimed that on his deathbed, Richard had begged for forgiveness, weeping like a child at what awaited him after his final breath. It was clear that this man carried heavy guilt, but nothing explained the absence of his body. I chatted discreetly with some older residents. One woman, her mind already weakened by age, said something that resonated with me. "He was never buried, son. What's in that grave is only the memory of a sin that cannot be erased." When I tried to ask for an explanation, she simply remained silent, looking at me with teary eyes, as if I'd said more than I should have. That night, back at the cemetery, the whispers grew more intense. It was as if the wind carried fragments of sentences, and among them, I swore I heard Richard's name repeated over and over again. The note in my hands seemed to pulse, as if it had a life of its own, demanding that I go further, that I unearth not just a missing body, but an entire history of denied forgiveness and family secrets buried in the darkness. The following nights were marked by a presence I couldn't shake. From the moment I found that note, my sleep ceased to be restful and became a breeding ground for disturbing visions. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw myself walking down narrow corridors lit only by slowly burning candles, and in the distance, the figure of a chained man, his face obscured by shadows, begging for something I couldn't understand. I woke in a cold sweat, with the feeling that his voice still echoed inside the room, repeating in a desperate tone, the same words I'd read in the note. He never rested here. At the cemetery, the signs became even clearer. I began to hear whispers that seemed to come from within the tombstones themselves, voices that mingled with the sound of the wind, but carried a clarity impossible to ignore. Every step I took between the graves seemed to be followed by invisible eyes, and I often felt icy fingers touch my shoulder, only to turn and find no one there. It was as if the whole place had awakened after I discovered the secret, and now it punished me for daring to see beyond the surface. It was in this state of torment that I decided to return to the records, searching for any mention of Richard's wife. I then discovered a detail that chilled me. In a letter preserved in the family archives, there was a confession from the woman herself, stating that she had refused to allow her husband's burial because she believed his soul did not deserve rest. For her, the dark pact Richard had made condemned him to an eternity of torment, and placing his body in the earth would be like allowing the illusion of forgiveness to be accepted. The empty coffin was not a mistake or negligence, but a deliberate punishment. After this discovery, everything intensified. I no longer walked through the cemetery as before. Every shadow seemed to move, every leaning cross seemed to watch me. One rainy dawn, I clearly heard a voice behind me, deep and drawn out, saying my name. When I turned, I saw a figure in rags with chains attached to its body, dragging itself toward me. The air became so heavy I could barely breathe, and for a moment I was sure I was standing before Richard, or what was left of him. I ran to the tomb in a desperate attempt to confront it, and found the note again, this time stained with what looked like fresh blood. The phrase was still the same, but the paper felt alive, as if it had just been written. In that moment, I understood that I wasn't just a spectator in an old story, but part of a curse still in motion. The denied forgiveness hadn't just imprisoned Richard, now it was enveloping me as well, dragging me into a web of guilt and condemnation I never imagined I would carry. The last night I was in that cemetery, I felt there was no escape. The note was no longer just a forgotten piece of paper, but a living warning that changed before my eyes. When I found it again on the empty coffin, I realized the letters had transformed. Now it said in a threatening tone, "Now you won't rest either." I gripped the paper tightly, but it felt as if my hands were passing through something other than the physical world. The ground beneath my feet trembled slightly, as if the earth itself rejected my presence, and a chill ran down my spine, making it clear I had been marked by the same fate as Richard. It was at that moment that I heard footsteps behind me, heavy and dragging, like chains being pulled. When I turned, there was no one in sight, but the air was thick with the certainty that I was not alone. The voices joined in a suffocating chorus, calling my name repeatedly, and for a moment I saw the shadows of the tombstones stretching toward me, like arms ready to swallow me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The note burned in my hands, and I had the terrible sensation that there was no longer any difference between the dead I guarded and the life I still had left. And that's when I realized what happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. The cemetery hid other tombs with even darker secrets, and each coffin seemed to whisper stories that should never be revealed. It was raining heavily that night, and the sound of the water hitting the headstones sounded like each drop was an impatient finger drumming on stone. I walked through the cemetery enveloped in a chill that came not just from the wind, but from a strange sensation that had been with me since the beginning of my shift. The job seemed simple. Open an old grave so the city could conduct a maintenance inspection, but nothing about it felt normal. The rusty gate creaked like a warning, and for a moment I swore I heard distant laughter, so subtle it might have been just a trick of the storm. The grave in question was small, marked by a crooked cross and a corroded metal plaque, on which the letters faded with time were barely distinguishable. As I lifted the lid of the small coffin, I braced myself for the inevitable silence of a child's remains. However, what I saw made me recoil, as if I'd opened the wrong door to a room I should never have entered. There were no bones, no body, only a disturbing emptiness. Inside the coffin, scattered with almost ritualistic care, were old toys. A porcelain doll with a cracked face, a rusty iron toy car, faded ribbons tied in fragile bows. And among them lay a folded note, so yellowed it seemed ready to disintegrate at the touch. When I opened it, I read the message that still echoes in my mind. He was taken back. In that moment, I realized this wasn't just another night job. I had tapped into a secret that lay dormant beneath the earth, and now it seemed awake, attentive, as if watching me. And perhaps that's why I need to tell who I am and how my own story became intertwined with this discovery. If you enjoy dark tales and want to hear every secret the gravediggers reveal, subscribe to the channel now and leave your like to strengthen this investigation. My name is Samuel Miller, and life, in a way I didn't choose, has forced me to live with death daily. From a young age, I was taught to work the land, carry shovels, and dig holes, but I never imagined I'd end up tending graves in a forgotten cemetery in rural Georgia. For most, it's a profession that borders on the grotesque, a burden everyone tries to keep away from. But for me, it became a form of silence, a refuge where I could exist without anyone demanding joy or words I could no longer find within myself. The truth is, I was never just a gravedigger. I was, first and foremost, a father. Years ago, I had a daughter, and on an ordinary afternoon, one of those, when time seems harmless, an accident took her from me in a brutal and inexplicable way. Since then, I have never found rest in my days, and each grave I opened seemed to remind me of the smallness of life and the fragility we all carry without realizing it. Perhaps that's why I accepted this work as something natural, because the dead didn't demand smiles from me, and their silence was less painful than the silence my house held after she was gone. However, there's a difference between accepting death and learning to live with the signs it insists on leaving behind. I knew every corner of that cemetery, every headstone, every gnarled tree growing among the graves, but there were still nights when I felt something watching me, as if the dead wanted to share secrets with me that no one else would hear. I carried with me the feeling that the earth hid not only bodies, but stories that refused to remain buried. And it was precisely because of this sensitivity that upon opening the child's coffin, I felt I wasn't just a worker performing an ordinary task. The emptiness of that small coffin seemed to speak directly to the pain I already carried, as if fate had chosen my hands to reveal something that should have remained hidden. It was at that moment that I realized that the routine that kept me alive was about to be shattered by an event that would forever change my relationship with death. That cloudy afternoon, I returned to the tomb with the strange feeling that I was not just about to open a coffin, but rather to break a pact of silence the earth had maintained for decades. The previous night's rain had soaked the ground, and each blow of the shovel produced a heavy sound, as if the earth were protesting my insistence on disturbing it. The child's coffin, small and battered, emerged from the clay with a fragility that made me hesitate for a few seconds. There was a respect within me that I couldn't explain, as if I were about to touch something that didn't belong to me. Carefully I removed the lid. The smell of damp wood mingled with that of wet earth, but there was no distinctive odor of death, and it sent an immediate chill through me. Inside I found no bones, no decaying remains, just old toys carefully arranged, as if someone had prepared a stage for discovery. There was a porcelain doll with a cracked face, whose glass eyes seemed to stare at me silently, an iron cart with rusted wheels, small, faded ribbons tied in fragile bows. In the center lay a note, yellowed with age, folded with precision. My hands trembled as I opened it, and the phrase written in irregular handwriting struck me like a sentence. He was taken back. There was no signature, no reference whatsoever, just those words that echoed in my mind like a child's whisper. It was as if the coffin itself was telling me it had never fulfilled its purpose. As I surveyed the scattered toys, I noticed something even more disturbing. Marks on the inner lining, small. Impressions that resembled the outlines of tiny hands pressed against the wood. The void before me wasn't just absence, but the insistent presence of something that never found rest. And it was there, with the note burning in my hands, that I understood that I needed to find out who that child had been, and why the entire city seemed to have buried not a body, but a carefully constructed secret. After that discovery, I couldn't sleep peacefully. The note lingered in my mind like a repetitive voice, and the toys seemed to still be with me, even after being left in the cemetery. I needed answers, and so I returned to the old town registry office, a dusty place where records sat forgotten on shelves that seemed more like surveillance than storage. I spent hours leafing through yellowed pages until a name caught my eye: Elias Thompson. According to records, he had disappeared in 1947 at the age of 7 and had never been found. The death certificate described a symbolic burial, a funeral held without a body, with only the boy's belongings, as if the family needed to bring closure to a grief they had never explained. However, the rumors I encountered were even more disturbing. An old newspaper mentioned that, after the disappearance, residents claimed to hear children's laughter coming from the cemetery on windy nights. Some reported seeing a small figure running through the trees, like an impossible-to-follow shadow. The article concluded with an uncomfortable sentence: "Perhaps Elijah never left this place." I decided to talk to the town's elders, hoping to find something beyond legend. That's when I met Mr. Harris, a man in his 80s, who looked me in the eye as if he knew the reason for my visit even before I spoke. In a low voice, he told me that he had been one of those present at the symbolic funeral, and that he remembered Elias's mother well, a woman who never accepted the loss. Harris swore that on the night of the funeral he saw the woman, kneeling before the small coffin, weeping and repeating over and over that he would be brought back, as if speaking to someone invisible. It chilled me to the core. It wasn't just a farewell funeral, but a ritual laden with grief. Perhaps even something darker, the idea that someone could believe their son would return even without a body, opened the door to questions I wasn't prepared to ask. That night back at the cemetery, the wind carried with it a sound that paralyzed me. Between the graves, I heard a childish laugh, short and soft, as if someone were playing hide-and-seek in the darkness. I looked around, but there was nothing but the shadows cast by the pale moon. Still, I had the strange feeling that Elijah was nearby, watching my every step, waiting for the right moment to reveal himself. The nights that followed became a torment I couldn't control. Every time I closed my eyes, I was transported to scenes that didn't seem like dreams, but fragments of a memory that wasn't mine. I found myself in an old nursery, lit by a dim lamp, where toys were scattered across the floor. There was laughter, small footsteps running back and forth, and a sense of distorted innocence, as if a child's joy had been corrupted by something unseen. When I tried to approach, the figure of a boy appeared, motionless from behind, and before I could turn away, I woke in a cold sweat, convinced that Elias wasn't just in my memories, but infiltrating my thoughts. At the cemetery, the situation was even more unbearable. I began to hear light footsteps behind me, as if small feet were following the rhythm of my walk. Once, while tending to another grave, I clearly heard a child's voice say my name, soft, drawn out, almost like an invitation. When I turned, there was no one there, only the porcelain doll, previously left inside the coffin, now resting on a nearby headstone, as if it had walked there on its own. The air grew heavy, and each breath seemed to carry the scent of damp earth mixed with something sweet, reminiscent of childhood candy, forgotten for decades. The visions began to transcend the limits of wakefulness. Toys appeared in my house, arranged exactly as they had been in the coffin. The wheels of the small iron cart turned on their own, producing a metallic creak that echoed through the hallways. One morning, I awoke to the sound of laughter coming from the backyard, and looking out the window saw a childlike silhouette standing under the tree, holding one of the faded ribbons. Elias was there, not as a memory or a shadow, but as a real presence, and he stared at me with a disturbing calm. It was then that the boundary between reality and imagination ceased to exist for me. I began to feel small touches on my hands, as if fragile fingers were guiding me through the darkness. The voices became clearer, and among them all, one phrase began to repeat in my ear. "You know where I am." It was as if Elias was inviting me to follow him, to discover a place that remained hidden, perhaps the same place where his body had never rested. I was no longer just a curious gravedigger. I was becoming part of the story, drawn into a plot that wouldn't let me back down. And even knowing the danger, I felt I wouldn't find peace until I followed the tracks of this child who had never been buried. The last night I walked through the cemetery, the silence felt heavier than ever, as if even the wind feared to blow through those twisted trees. The note I found in the small coffin no longer said, "He was taken back." The letters had changed before my eyes, and now formed a new sentence, written in a hurried, almost desperate hand. "He will not rest until he takes another with him." I felt the paper burn in my hands, as if it were a burning coal, and in that instant I understood that I was no longer observing Elias's story from a distance, but had been sucked into it, like the next piece in a game that never ended. The air turned chilly, and I felt a small, cold hand intertwine my fingers. I didn't dare look, but I knew it was him, the boy who was never buried, the same one now seeking company to fill the void left in his coffin. The voices rose in a children's chorus, laughing and crying at the same time, echoing between the tombstones like a symphony of innocence and condemnation. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come, and when I finally looked to the side, I saw only the porcelain doll smiling crackedly, as if it had witnessed every second of my surrender. Days later, residents reported hearing not one, but two children's voices echoing in the cemetery. Some claim that Elias is no longer alone, and that other tombs hold similar secrets, waiting only for the right moment to reveal themselves. That night, the silence of the cemetery was so absolute, it seemed to contain a truth hidden beneath the earth. The wind barely stirred, and even the ever-restless trees remained still, as if watching my every step carefully. I walked slowly to the tomb of the former Father Jonathan Reeves, a name that still echoed in the town's oldest memories. They said he had died decades ago, but his story has always been shrouded in rumors and secrets that the church has never publicly confirmed. I was Supposed to simply open the tomb for a routine inspection, another monotonous task that required patience and strength, but something that night told me I was about to witness something different, something that should never be revealed. When the aged wood of the coffin finally gave way beneath my hands, I expected to find the inevitable: brittle bones, dust, and the remains of a body corroded by time. But what I saw made me hold my breath and instinctively recoil. The interior was empty, completely devoid of any human trace. Instead, pinned to the lining were ancient pages of a torn Bible, glued as if someone had nailed those words directly to the wood. The pages were stained, some with traces of dark ink, others with violent tears, as if they had been ripped out with hatred. In the center, a handwritten sentence stood out like a silent scream: his faith was stolen. I held the note for too long, unable to understand whether it was a confession, an accusation, or a curse left as an eternal mark. And in that instant, I understood that I had not merely opened a coffin, but broken the seal on a secret that should have remained buried forever. If you enjoy dark tales and want to hear every secret the gravediggers reveal, subscribe to the channel now and leave your like to strengthen this investigation. My name is Michael Turner, and perhaps it's ironic that life has led me back to the very thing I tried hardest to abandon. Before becoming a gravedigger, I was a seminarian, trained to serve at the altar and to believe that faith was the shield capable of protecting any man from the weight of darkness. For a time, I believed this with all my might, until God's silence in the face of my own prayers consumed me. Years ago, when I lost my mother in circumstances that still seem unjust to me today, I felt that every word that came out of my mouth meant only emptiness, as if there were no one listening on the other side. It was at that moment that I realized my vocation was nothing more than a shell, and I left the seminary feeling that the faith that sustained me had dissolved without a trace. Working as a gravedigger seemed to many a morbid choice, but for me it became a way to survive without having to face the light head-on. The dead don't ask questions, don't demand sermons, they simply rest in silence, and that silence was the only one I could bear. I began to live among tombstones and dead trees, treating each grave as a mechanical duty, as if burying bodies were easier than dealing with the memories of all I'd lost. Still, no matter how much I tried to convince myself that nothing could surprise me anymore, I always felt there was something too alive in that cemetery, as if each tomb held more than bones, held stories that had never been confessed. When I was ordered to open Father Reeves's tomb, I didn't think it would be any different than other times. To me, it was just another body, forgotten by time, another task to fill the days that dragged by. However, from the moment I touched the tomb, an uneasy feeling took hold of me, as if that tomb knew my story better than I did, as if it mocked my past and the faith I'd abandoned. And when I saw the empty coffin, covered in torn pages from the Bible, I knew it was no coincidence. It was as if this discovery had been made for me, as if fate had chosen my hands to reveal the secret the church had tried to bury with it. The interior of that coffin looked more like a desecrated altar than a resting place. The torn pages of the Bible were not arranged haphazardly. Some were glued so firmly to the lining that it seemed as if someone had nailed those words to the wood, as if to imprison within them a curse or a denunciation. I scanned the highlighted lines and realized they were not passages of consolation or salvation, but passages that spoke of betrayal, heresy, and the fall. It was as if someone had handpicked only the phrases that highlighted the corruption of faith and the condemnation of those who stray from the path. The central sentence, handwritten in a jagged script, remained etched in my mind. His faith was stolen. I tried to understand if this was an accusation against the priest or a confession he'd made himself. The fact that there was no body made everything even more suffocating, as if absence were the greatest evidence. No trace of bones, no signs of decay, just that emptiness weighted with an invisible weight. As I stood before the coffin, a strange sensation washed over me. The air seemed colder, and I swear for a moment I heard a distant voice murmuring in Latin, words I recognized from old sermons, but which sounded different, filled with resentment and pain. I felt my knees weaken, and a part of me wanted to close the coffin and forget what I had seen, but another, deeper part knew I couldn't turn away. That emptiness spoke directly to the emptiness I had carried since I lost my faith, as if the absence of my body were a mirror of the absence that lived within me. It was at that moment that I realized I could not rest until I discovered the truth about Father Reeves and the secrets his parish had hidden from the entire town. In the days that followed, the image of that empty coffin and the torn pages wouldn't leave me alone. No matter how hard I tried to return to my routine at the cemetery, I always ended up mentally returning to the same point, the sentence that said his faith had been stolen. So I decided to seek answers in the city's old archives, a dark, stuffy building where the smell of dust and aged paper mingled with the weight of history no one wanted to remember. I spent hours leafing through local parish records until I found mention of Father Jonathan Reeves, and each line seemed more disturbing than the last. Officially, Reeves had been recognized as a dedicated priest, but among the forgotten pages of internal diocesan reports, I found notes that spoke of unusual practices. Some reports suggested he secretly performed violent penances, brutally punishing himself in an attempt at purification. Others spoke of sermons that deviated from orthodoxy, in which he distorted biblical passages as if preaching a corrupted version of the divine message. While he attracted fascinated devotees, he also aroused distrust among his superiors, who saw signs of heresy in his words. I spoke with longtime residents, people who still remembered the rumors that circulated in the town during the priest's final years. A tired-looking woman told me that she once heard Latin prayers echoing late at night from the church, but that it wasn't Mass. She described voices in chorus, as if Reeves weren't alone, and when she dared to peek through the windows, she swore she saw strange symbols drawn on the floor in front of the altar. Others spoke of secret meetings, late-night gatherings where only a select few were invited, and that they always left the church with empty eyes, as if they had left something behind. Most disturbing was hearing from a former altar boy, now elderly, that Reeves believed he had made a pact to expand his parish and that in exchange he had lost his own faith. For him, the priest died not as a man of God, but as someone condemned by God's own silence. The town, however, chose to remain silent, burying him with honors to avoid scandal, but inside the coffin lay no body. Only a void that screamed louder than any sermon. It was at that moment that I understood I had not only uncovered a secret, but also opened a path that led directly to it. And with each step of this investigation, I felt as if the priest were watching me, waiting for me to get even closer to what he wanted to reveal. From the moment I discovered the records and heard the stories about Father Reeves, something changed in the cemetery. The space that had once offered me silence began to be filled with noises I couldn't ignore. In the wee hours of the morning, when the city fell asleep, and I walked among the graves, Latin voices echoed softly as if coming from the very ground. At first, I thought it was just my tired mind, still trapped in the stories I'd heard, but I soon realized those words were too real to be a figment of my imagination. I recognized in them fragments of prayers I'd learned in seminary, only distorted, spoken with an intonation laden with resentment, as if they weren't pleas, but accusations. The nights became dominated by increasingly vivid dreams. I saw Father Reeves in his torn cassock, his face marred by scars I didn't remember seeing in old photographs, and in his hands he held a burning Bible. His eyes were dark and deep-set, and when they fixed on mine, I felt as if I were being swallowed by an abyss. He repeated in a deep, drawn-out voice, "They stole my faith." I would wake up with my heart racing, my body drenched in sweat, and the feeling that the phrase still echoed in the room, hanging in the air like a sentence that enveloped me. This cemetery, once a routine place, began to transform before my eyes. Crosses toppled for no apparent reason, images of saints cracked in half as if corroded by an invisible force, and even the small chapel nearby seemed darker, its walls stained with infiltrations that resembled the shadows of screaming faces. During my rounds, I noticed shadows creeping between the tombstones, always on the periphery of my vision, as if mocking me, revealing themselves just enough so I would never doubt their presence. The worst part was realizing that the emptiness of the coffin wasn't just a physical absence, but a reflection of what I myself carried. Leaving the seminary had left a hole inside me, and now that space seemed to expand, as if Reeves had found in me the continuation of his condemnation. It was as if his heresy seeped into my blood, slowly stealing any shred of faith I might still have. I began to doubt my own sanity, as I would often hear footsteps behind me, only to turn and find nothing but torn pages scattered across the floor, as if falling out of nowhere. I realized with a profound terror that I wasn't just an observer of this story. Somehow, I was becoming part of it, dragged toward the same fate as Reeves. And the more I tried to resist, the clearer it became that the line between the heretical priest and myself grew ever thinner. That early morning, I returned to Father Reeves's tomb as if walking into my own damnation. The air was heavy, permeated by a silence that felt like a warning, and the moon, shrouded in thick clouds, cast writhing shadows like the figures of invisible penitents. I opened the coffin again, expecting to find the same emptiness as before, but this time something had changed. Pinned to the lining, among the already torn pages, was a new sheet of paper, still damp with dark ink, as if it had been placed there minutes before my arrival. The sentence chilled me completely. "Now your faith has been stolen too." I felt a crushing weight on my chest, and my knees buckled at that revelation. There was no way this could have been the work of human hands, and within me grew the certainty that the priest sought not only revenge against the church that had condemned him, but also companionship in the eternity of his heresy. I heard footsteps behind me, firm and dragging, accompanied by a murmur in Latin that seemed to be chanting an inverted mass. When I turned, I saw no one, only the shadow cast on the coffin, a figure with a torn cassock and eyes that seemed to stare directly into my soul. I ran outside, but the cemetery offered no escape. The fallen crosses seemed to close in on me, trapping me in the very space where Reeves still preached his twisted sermon. And in that moment, I understood. His faith had been stolen, and now mine too. They say that since then, at night, two voices joined together in dark sermons coming from the cemetery. That night the sky was heavy, covered by clouds that hid the moon and plunged the cemetery into near-total darkness. The air seemed dense, permeated with the scent of damp earth and dead flowers, and every step I took echoed as if the silence itself was warning me not to proceed. I had been called to open an old tomb, the kind that hadn't been visited by family in a long time, and I confess I hadn't expected to find anything other than bones worn by time and a coffin corroded by damp. However, something about that burial caught my attention from the start. The headstone, though simple, bore the image of two intertwined rings, as if symbolizing a broken promise. As I removed the hardened earth and reached the coffin, my hands trembled more than usual. My work as a gravedigger had accustomed me to the inevitable, but there was an inexplicable discomfort in that particular opening. With effort, I lifted the lid and, instead of mortal remains, I found a disturbing void. The body was gone. In its place lay a carefully folded wedding dress, the fabric yellowed with age, but still retaining a strange beauty that seemed to mock death. Among the aged lace, I found a hidden letter, written in delicate, trembling handwriting. Its words cut through me like an invisible blade. He never let me be his wife. I stood paralyzed, unable to understand whether I was witnessing a gesture of interrupted love or a confession made hastily in the midst of despair. The absence of the body and the presence of the dress transformed that coffin into a macabre altar for a ceremony never consummated. And it was then that I realized I needed to understand who that bride had been and why her story remained buried in silence. If you enjoy dark tales and want to hear every secret the gravediggers reveal, subscribe to the channel now and leave your like to strengthen this investigation. My name is Edward Collins, and as strange as it may sound, I spent half my life surrounded by graves, dedicating my days to maintaining order among those who no longer breathe. For many, being a gravedigger is a burden too dark to bear, but for me, it became the only way to live with the silence that life never gave me. Death demands no explanations, no answers, simply rests in its eternity, and I found in this silence a companion more faithful than any real person. But I wasn't always like this. There was a time when I believed in love, a time when I found myself before an altar ready to make promises, until the woman I planned to share my life with decided to abandon me days before the wedding. The humiliation and pain of this loss were like a shovel of lime over my faith in human feeling. Perhaps that's why, when I found the dress in the empty coffin, I felt there was something in that scene that spoke directly to me. Fate seemed to laugh at my own story, showing that even in death love could be denied. I knew the expressions of grief, the faces marked by goodbyes, but nothing compared to the silence of a disembodied coffin, holding only the memory of a broken promise. It was as if the emptiness of my life had found a reflection within that abandoned coffin. My routine had always been meticulous. I arrived early, cleared the paths, checked the graves, and noted minor maintenance tasks. Every fallen cross, every wilted flower was a reminder that time spares no one. But that night, everything felt different. I felt as if the tombstones were watching my reaction, as if the cemetery itself had waited years for me to be the one chosen to open that very grave. I should have closed the coffin and moved on, treating it as just another of the many mysteries the earth holds without asking for an explanation. But something inside me refused to let it go. There was a call in that dress, a whisper that seemed to tell me the story wasn't over yet. And I knew that if I didn't seek answers, I would never again be able to look upon the silence of death with the same indifference. As I peered into the coffin, I felt as if I were desecrating something that didn't belong to me, as if I'd been invited to witness a secret that should never be revealed. The dress lay with a strange delicacy, as if careful hands had placed it there to preserve a ceremony that never took place. The fabric, though yellowed with age, still retained the pale sheen of lace and the pattern of stitching, details that seemed to mock the emptiness surrounding it. Hidden within the folds, I found the letter, almost as if it had been sewn into the silence of the coffin. As I opened it, my hands trembled more than usual, and the words written in faded ink pierced me with the force of an eternal lament. He never let me be his wife. I paused for a moment, trying to understand if those words were a cry of pain or an accusation against someone who had prevented her from achieving what seemed to be her life's dream. The longer I stared at the shaky handwriting, the more I sensed desperation in every stroke, as if the author had written in haste before disappearing. The silence around me intensified, and I swear I noticed a sweet scent, like flowers from an old bouquet, mingling with the cold odor of damp earth. I felt as if someone was still there, watching, waiting for me to understand the message left within that lace. Closing the coffin seemed impossible. Every time I tried to lower the lid, I heard the rustle of lace, as if the dress were moving on its own, breathing. There was something alive in that emptiness, a presence that held me captive and demanded more than my curiosity. It was at that moment that I realized I couldn't dismiss this as just a forgotten detail of the past. I needed to discover who that bride had been, why her body wasn't there, and what had really happened the day she should have walked down the aisle. That letter stuck in my mind. I spent days feeling as if the words hadn't just been written for someone in the past, but were meant for me, as if I'd been chosen to unearth a secret the town had buried along with that dress. I decided to search for old records, and to do so, I went to the small municipal library, where the dusty archives held more memories than any tomb. Sifting through yellowed newspapers and forgotten notes, I found the first clue. The name, Margaret Holloway, the bride who mysteriously disappeared in the 1950s, on the very day she was supposed to get married. News reports at the time spoke of a hushed-up scandal. Margaret never made it to the church, and despite an intense search, her body was never found. The wedding had been prepared with every luxury the family could offer, and the groom, Charles Whitmore, was an influential young man, heir to one of the city's most respected families. However, rumors swirled that Charles had a violent temper marked by obsessive jealousy. Some said he would never allow Margaret to leave his, even if it meant brutally preventing the marriage. I spoke with older residents, and although most avoided discussing the matter, a woman named Helen, already in her 80s, broke the silence. With a trembling voice, she said she had been present the day Margaret disappeared. She remembered seeing the young woman in her wedding dress, smiling nervously, but also witnessing an intense argument between her and Charles minutes before the ceremony. After that, no one saw her again. All they heard was the church bells ringing, but the altar remained empty, and the celebration turned into silent mourning. Helen's revelation gave me chills, but what she said next left me in shock. With tears in her eyes, she whispered that that very night, while walking near the cemetery, she saw a female figure dressed in white among the tombstones. She thought it was just a figment of her imagination, disturbed by the scandal, until she noticed the woman holding a wilted bouquet and walking toward the newly prepared grave. The disturbing detail is that days later, this same grave was closed as if it had received a body, but in truth, only the wedding dress had been buried there. This information made everything take on new weight. It wasn't just a tragedy of a broken marriage, but a macabre performance designed to hide something terrible. And the more I discovered, the more I felt that Margaret still wandered among us, waiting for someone to give her a voice. After hearing Helen's story, I returned to the cemetery feeling as if every step was guided by something greater than my own will. The night seemed denser than ever, and darkness seeped into every space, as if trying to hide something from me while simultaneously forcing me to continue. I walked to the bride's grave with the letter in hand, and the closer I got, the stronger the smell of old flowers became, as if a bouquet abandoned decades ago still lay there, exuding a rotten scent. The feeling that I was not alone became undeniable. Over the next few nights, the dreams began. Always. The same scenario. I found myself in an old church, the pews covered in dust and the altar illuminated by a dim light coming from cracked stained glass windows. Margaret stood before me, dressed as a bride, but her face remained covered by a veil that fluttered without the wind. She raised her hand as if to speak, but when she tried to open her mouth, I realized her lips were sewn shut by invisible threads. The sound coming from her throat was a muffled wail, a desperate cry that echoed throughout the empty church. I woke in a sweat, still feeling the lump in my throat of someone who had heard a request they couldn't understand. During my rounds in the cemetery, the apparitions began to manifest themselves more clearly. Among the tombstones, I saw the silhouette of a bride walking slowly, holding a wilted bouquet that dropped dark petals along the path. Each time I tried to follow her, she disappeared around the curve of the wall, leaving only her dress swaying in the air, as if still filled with an invisible body. The voices also became more present. Sometimes they were soft whispers, repeating disjointed phrases. Other times they were masculine screams of fury, as if two forces were locked in eternal conflict in that same space, the victim seeking justice and the man who never let her go. One morning, I felt something even more disturbing. As I passed the grave, I clearly saw a female hand emerging from the lace of the dress inside the coffin, pale fingers reaching for the air, as if trying to break through the barrier of oblivion. My instinct was to recoil, but the hand disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving the fabric intact, as if nothing had happened. However, what truly shook me was the realization that it wasn't just Margaret's presence that haunted that place. There was something else, a force that seemed to protect the secret, a deep male voice echoing in my mind. She will always be mine, even in death. In that moment, I understood that Margaret sought not only to be remembered, but also to be freed. And this liberation would not come without cost, for I felt myself being thrust into this story, dragged into the role of witness, and perhaps surrogate in a marriage that never made it to the altar. The last night I returned to the tomb, I felt there was no turning back. The wind blew fiercely, making the trees bend like silent witnesses to something that shouldn't happen. When I opened the coffin again, the dress looked different, as if whiter, renewed, and between the folds I found a new letter written in fresh ink, still damp, as if it had just been left there. The sentence completely paralyzed me. Now you will witness what was never accomplished. Suddenly the air turned chilly, and invisible hands firmly touched my shoulders. As I stared into the reflection of the broken glass of a nearby tombstone, I saw not just myself, but the image of a man dressed as a groom, standing beside a woman in wedding attire. The veil hid her face, but I knew it was Margaret. She held my arm with the delicacy of someone preparing to walk down the aisle, and her sewn lips moved as if about to part. The sound of bells echoed through the cemetery, low and slow, and in that instant I realized I wasn't just watching a ghost, but participating in a ceremony that had never ended. They say that since then, some residents swear they have seen a bride walking at night among the tombstones, accompanied by a silent man that no one has ever been able to recognize. If you want to hear the next stories and delve even deeper into the mysteries that death insists on keeping, subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell. Your presence will be essential for me to continue revealing secrets that should never be unearthed.